Thank you so much for the introduction, Virginia. And good evening, everyone. I am one of 2,500 Gore associates here in Flagstaff, and we're part of a team of over 11,000 associates worldwide. Here in Flagstaff, we focus on innovating and manufacturing medical devices. And over the past 45 years, there have been 50 million Gore medical devices implanted in patients all throughout the world. However, Gore doesn't just create medical devices. We create a wide array of different products, different technologies, and materials. It's often said that not a day goes by where all of us aren't touched somehow by a Gore product. So whether it's the Gore-Tex jacket you use when you hike up Humphreys Peak, the inner workings of your car as you hop across town, the protective products that helped our essential workers in this pandemic, or even the guitar strings you use to play your favorite song. Our engineers and associates at Gore change the world with their creativity, and it's all with the application of science and technology. I'd like to introduce a video that provides an overview and a little bit more in depth about the technologies and capabilities we have here at Gore.
We look at the world and see endless possibilities to improve life. By discovering partnerships that develop into relationships, so we can overcome life's obstacles together. We are compassionate. We seek to protect not only those we care for, but to improve the future for those we may never meet. We are dreamers, explorers, thinkers and tinkerers, creators and collaborators who stretch our minds and suspend disbelief so that as soon as one dream is reached, it becomes a stepping stone to another. Because the uninhibited mind doesn't fit inside any sized box. In fact, it designs a whole new one. At Gore, freedom unlocks the human spirit, empowering those who are anything but ordinary to reimagine the truly extraordinary. We are in your hearts, in your souls, bouncing around 230,000 miles above, connecting dots across all 7 seas. We are cleaning the air in there. We help you see, hear, and feel chords A through G. We are where you expect us to be, where you need us to be, and in some places where, quite frankly, you'd never believe. There's no secret to our scientific method. Just mix together equal parts curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. From the new materials we gather and advancements we make, to the breathtaking, blood-pumping, inconceivable places it takes us. We are together, always pushing forward. That is our nature. This is our promise. Together, improving life.
So you heard Gore's mission there, together improving life. It's all based on application of science and of technology, which is why we are so honored to support the Flagstaff Festival of Science for the past 32 years. Whether it's using science and technology to explore the inner workings of the human body, the mysteries of outer space, ancient history, including early Maya civilizations, science helps us better understand our world. To help us understand stories in stone, tonight we have our keynote speaker. His name is Dr. Jaime Awe. As a young boy, Jaime loved to explore the archaeological site near his home in Belize. He would often wonder, what's buried underneath that dirt? And the curiosity and the passion for discovery continued. And now he is one of the world's top experts in the Maya civilization of Belize. And he has been honored for many of his great discoveries. Dr. Jaime Awe is an associate professor of anthropology here at NAU. Prior to joining NAU, he served as the head of the Belize Institute of Archaeology, the highest position in his field in the country. He has a great enthusiasm for involving students in his archaeological explorations, and he's got a true passion for training the next generation of great scientists. Please help me welcome Dr. Jaime Awe to the stage for our W. Gore and Associates keynote presentation.
I think I got this. Oh, awesome. Good evening, and it's really a privilege and an honor to be here tonight to share some of my research with you, and talk about much of the work that I've had this incredible privilege to do back in Belize. Now, I should tell you that when I first got the email inviting me to be the speaker at the opening event tonight, the first thought that I had was, or the question that I had, and I think it was to Elizabeth Vogler, was to ask what the theme was going to be. And when she said to me that it was going to be stories in stone, the first thought I had was watching countless episodes of the Flintstones with my older kids. The other thing that I thought about was listening to these guys, right, for many years. But if you notice carefully there, right, these guys are getting really old. In fact, they even look archaeological. And as a result, I've started to refer to them as the strolling bones. Now, often when some people hear about archaeology, the person that readily comes to their mind is this dude here on this slide. Now, I should tell you this, that many of us real deal archaeologists, we have some issues with Indy. He gets all the fame and the glamour. He gets paid a hell of a lot more money than I get paid for NAU. And whenever he's finished the set, right, he usually goes to this fancy trailer. He gets a massage, a hot shower, probably some fancy meal prepared by somebody else. Well, we real deal archaeologists don't get that. Right? Often we have to fight the elements, and then, we spend a lot of time scraping our knees, bumping our heads, trying to explore sites or caves. And then we end up sleeping in a tent, on the floor of the tent. And if it rains, we get wet. And so it's not surprising that, you do that for 2 days. And as you can see from this picture of my wife and I, after 2 days of doing that, you're pooped. No great massage, no fancy meal, and nobody to give you a massage. Because of that, every once in a while, when I watch, the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, every once in a while, I just wish the stone would get Indy. Well, a friend of mine has heard me say this, and not too long ago, he sent me this cartoon. And I was like, yes, finally, Indy gets his comeuppance. Right? Well, tonight, I want to, share with you the thing that I love doing the most. In fact, I feel that as being an archaeologist, we get to apply some incredible scientific techniques and methodologies, because archaeology is truly at that intersection between the social behavioral sciences like anthropology, sociology, and the hard sciences. And in archaeology, we try to apply every scientific technique that's out there if it means that it will improve our understanding of the human condition, both in the past as well as in the present. To help demonstrate that, I want to take you on a trip. And we're going to go from Arizona all the way down to the small country of Belize, the only English-speaking country in Central America. I had this incredible fortune that I was born in Belize. I grew up in Belize, so if I talk with a funny accent, that's probably the reason why. So I'm going to take you there and show you some of the things that I've been working on over several years. Now, as an archaeologist, we work at sites. And to find sites, it's very important to us because those are the places where we can learn about the past, where we can study where ancient peoples, established their homes. Well, in many parts of the world, finding sites is pretty easy. I mean, if you miss that, then you need to do something other than archaeology. Now, where I work, it's a lot different. Try to find a needle in a haystack, right? Finding sites in the tropical jungles of Belize can have a few challenges. And for many years in the past, what many of us would do is you drive down this dirt road, and when the road runs out, you park the truck and you jump out and you pull out your machetes and you go out there and you go look for sites. And sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. Sometimes, like I said, right, you have to fight the elements. If you're not trying to cross some river that's flooded, you might just have to go through some puddles. And on Lake Indy, you can see how one of my colleagues is having his lunch, pretty messy. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff that we sometimes have to do. Well, it's almost like some years ago, some divine person up there heard our plea to make our lives a little simpler. In fact, in the early 2000s, the National Center for Airborne and Laser Mapping, or NCOM, which is stationed in Houston, started to allow the public use of LiDAR technology for surveying in just about any different landscape in the world. And as soon as we heard about this, right, we had read a little bit about the magic of LiDAR. Some colleagues of mine who at that time were at the University of Central Florida and a few other colleagues and I applied for a small grant, which we got so we could go to apply LiDAR in Belize. And we did, especially at the site there called Cacao, the small area here. Now, both of us had worked at Cacao for many years. In fact, my wife and I did this amazing project with the Belize government that was 4 years long, where we were excavating a lot of the large buildings in the country of Belize so that we could develop them for tourism. And what I want you to see about this slide, though, is focus around the area around the site. It's like that image I showed you before. It's totally covered in thick jungle and primary jungle. When we got the LiDAR data back, and just in case, let me give you just a little brief description of how LiDAR works. Right? You have this plane. In fact, we applied for this small grant first, like I said, and we just took all that money and gave it to NCOM. They send this plane from Houston to Belize, and the plane flies, up and down a certain area, and then the other way. And it's shooting laser pulses down and it bounces back. I'm giving you a really simple description of this, right? It shoots back these pulses that's then recorded, and you take that data, put it in a computer, and then, you run it through a few programs. And I call it God's gift to the tropical archaeologist. It's like somebody gave you a magic wand, because then you can say, jungle, be gone. And the jungle is gone, and this is what you have, right? And when you look carefully at this, right, the detail that it brings out, the information that it provides us, there is that big pyramid that I showed you a little while ago that we were excavating. Well, you can see these are big reservoirs. These are ancient Maya roads built right through the jungle. There's another road there. There's another one going there. That's the modern road that you drive into the site. There's another reservoir. Look at all the top of the hills. They're completely occupied and covered by prehistoric buildings. And then along the sides of the hills, these are all agricultural terraces. Now, for us to have been able to capture all that detail, going out with our machetes would take years. And in a minute, as soon as we were able to look at that program on the computer, I think I drooled over the computer when we first saw that, right? Because it was like nothing we had ever seen. The other beauty about LiDAR is that you can manipulate that data. You can add color, you can put it at an angle to bring out some of the features a little more clearly. And here again, same site, but you can see by tweaking this information, the detail is, like I said, just not the kind of thing you can get from doing regular kinds of surveys. Well, because of the success of that, a bunch of my colleagues and I decided to apply for an even bigger grant. And I remember we got about almost $400,000 because we wanted to survey a huge chunk of the country of Belize, not just there, but all this area here, roughly about 1,000 square kilometers. And so NCOM said, well, we'll take all that money because it's not cheap to fly a plane with all this fancy equipment from Houston to Belize, and then they have to spend, a couple weeks flying this plane back and forth, and fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So we gave NCOM all that money, but in the end, we were the first projects in Mesoamerica to apply LiDAR survey for archaeological purposes. More recently, other colleagues working in Guatemala and Mexico have followed suit, but this was really the first major application of this new technology. The end result is that we've now been able to look at archaeological sites and get such a better understanding of settlement density. I mean, look, this is a different site. There you can see the river, the Belize River. This is the downtown part of that city. Every little one of these are either a group of ancient buildings or solitary buildings. You can even see, dried creek beds. You can see old river, the old meandering passage of the river. In other cases, like in this image here, we were even able to detect a lot of these canal systems that the Maya had excavated to manage water during times of flooding. So, like I said, the information that we were able to learn because of the application of LiDAR was just nothing we had ever seen or experienced before. Now, because I was part of this group of people that applied for this money and do all this LiDAR survey, I have been able to bring this LiDAR data here at NAU, and today many of our graduate students and even undergraduate students have been able to use this material, this information, and even learn how to understand LiDAR data. One of my colleagues, Dr. Smiley, at the anthropology department, has been helping with the training of our students. And one of my first graduate students, when I came to NAU in 2014, actually used this data to do his thesis about this one site. I'll start to go a little quicker. I know I have a lot of slides. Another amazing project that I have been conducting for many years in Belize is to explore and understand the ancient Maya underworld. In other words, I've been to many underground sites, cave sites, and almost every cave that I've been in, I have found evidence that the ancient Maya were there before I was. And trying to figure out what was the purpose of their visitation to some of these sites. So just to give you a little quick background on some of these unbelievable landscapes, right? Belize has thousands of caves. Many of them are very large. In fact, if you look here, there's a person standing on that rock. These are all individuals there when we took this photograph. Some caves like Barton Creek Cave, again, look, there's a person there and there's a person there. These are massive caverns. Others are not so large. Some of them are quite small, and you sometimes have to crawl and pull your body through small openings, but eventually you hope that it's going to open up into a bigger chamber. In some cases, you have to rappel down, right, to continue your exploration and your discoveries. One of the caves that was probably the top cave that I have ever worked in was this cave that we call Aktun Tunichil Muknal, or Cave of the Stone Sepulchre. I started doing research in this cave, and in fact, every now and then I still return to this cave with some of my students because there are still questions that we're trying to understand and try to answer. And at the entrance, you get a swim. And by the way, I hope the dean and the provost aren't here because they'll say, you're taking NAU students to do some of this stuff. I think CIE makes sure that we all have good insurance. But anyway, we go into some of the entrance, and just to show that it's safe for my students, I also take my wife and my two boys, and they also traverse through the caves with me. Well, one of the beautiful things about Aktun Tunichil Muknal is that almost 1/3 of the cave has evidence that the ancient Maya utilized this cave. And I want to share with you some of the incredible discoveries that we made in here. If you look at the slide, right, one of the first things we do is, is to do a survey of the site. That's the entrance. And we mapped about almost 5 kilometers in length of this cave. And the areas that had the most evidence of ancient Maya use was, I keep doing that. Is this area right about here. And I want to take you to a couple of spots, the Stela chamber and that other chamber, just to give you a taste of some of the things that we discovered there. The Stela chamber was very interesting for us because it had a bunch of what we call speleothems, broken stalagmites and stalactites. But if you notice carefully, they were supporting these 2 large monuments made out of slate. But they were not just 2 ordinary slabs of slate. In fact, when you look at them, right, you can see that this one here has notches along the side, and this one tends to taper, more pointy. Here's a better shot of it, right? Now, I remember sitting there the first time we discovered these monuments, and I was trying to understand, well, why? Why are they in that shape? And then I started to realize that the Maya had purposely carved them in those forms. Why? Because when you look at this one on the left, the one right here, it reminds me very much of an implement that the ancient Maya often used to do bloodletting ceremonies. Now, we know both from information that was written down after Spanish contact and also because of information during the early years of Spanish contact, that the Maya, during certain rituals, would offer their blood to their gods. One of the things that they would do is they would either pierce their tongue, their thumb, and other parts of their body, and would collect that blood and offer it to the gods. And as you can see in this picture here, we know that the 2 main implements used in this were stingray spines. Here's a stingray spine, and sometimes a pointy obsidian blade. And when you look at the image here, obviously that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to mimic a stingray spine. Here you can see some individual actually doing an experiment where they pierce their finger. I would not advise you to do that. The other fragment of slate looks more like the obsidian bloodletter. And here you can see this is actually a little obsidian blade that we found at the base of these monuments. So we know that the Maya were stopping right here on this very spot and letting blood, offering their blood to the gods that they believed resided in the cave. And in case you think I'm making this up, you can see from this slide, in this case, you see this male holding a torch. It's in the dark. And there's a woman who's running a rope with thorns through her tongue, right? So we have great evidence that the ancient Maya did participate in these kinds of activities. When we move up to this large chamber in the cave, there's also some really good information that the Maya were certainly conducting other types of activities there. This area we call the main chamber. It's really beautiful. I know that some people here in the audience have been to Belize and may have gone to visit this cave. I like cave research, not just because of the archaeology, but just because of the sheer beauty of some of these underground sites. The formations are just, the colors that change from one room to the other, again, make some of these chambers very, very attractive. Well, in ATM, when you hit this main chamber, the entire floor is completely covered in artifacts. In fact, everything you see sticking above the ground here are ancient Maya objects. In many cases, too, most of these objects have been broken. And today we know that the reason why they're broken is because the Maya believed that these objects had spirit. And after they used them in ceremonies and rituals, it was important and necessary for you to release the spirit of those objects. And you did that by smashing them, or sometimes just knocking off a little piece by the rim, or even cutting a small hole that we call kill holes. Even grinding stones that we find in some of these caves, you can see this grinding stone, has a chunk broken off. In this case, it was a figurine of a little dog that was actually a little whistle, or an ocarina, as we call them. And after they had finished with the ceremony, they broke off the head to, again, release the spirit of the object. Now, one of the things that we have started to do with some of the materials that we find in the caves is trying to determine their purpose. Not just what are they doing in the cave, but what were they used for? And to answer that question, we sometimes have to go to the hard science. In this case, we can do something called residue analysis. For instance, there's the metate. We can take a sharp, sometimes just a razor blade, and you scrape the surface of it and you collect that. And then you send it off to a lab where we can test to try to determine what it was used for. Many of the metates that we have found in caves usually contain evidence of corn, that they were grinding corn on it, sometimes manioc. In some cases, they were using it for other purposes. The little bloodletter, remember I told you that they were using some of these to pierce their tongue or their thumb and other parts of their body? Well, we can also do residue analysis on those. And just like in some of the episodes on forensic, what's that TV show again? We often see that, you can use good science to determine whether there's human blood or animal blood. And that is important because sometimes we know that they offered animals as well as humans in sacrifice. And we have often found residues of blood on some of these objects. In another good example of this is looking at these pots where, again, we can do residue analysis by scraping the bottom. One of the things that was really interesting about this study is that there are many artifacts that we find when we excavate. And because today we can now read the hieroglyphs, many of them sometimes say, this is the cacao drinking vessel of Lord so-and-so. Now, cacao is a chocolate, right? Just like we drink hot chocolate today. In fact, we know that cacao was domesticated in Central America, and then the Europeans took it back across the ocean, and then chocolate was eventually produced. Well, we were able to get some residues from some of these vessels. We sent it off to Pennsylvania, to Hershey's. And there they did the test, and sure enough, they came back and they said to us, there's evidence that these vessels contain theobroma. Theobroma is the scientific name for cacao. Yeah. And again, we have some really good images from the Maya themselves that they processed this chocolate, this cacao. In fact, often when people visited important rulers, when they had the meet and greet period, as you can see, here you can see the ruler, there's probably some attendant, and this individual is here visiting. But if you look closely at that pot, it's frothing at the top. Obviously, it contained cacao. Down below, you have a pot that contained tamales. So by doing the science, we're able to then provide even greater evidence and confirm some of the images that we tried to interpret. In other cases, we find pots that contain cobs of corn. We know that the Maya would go into these caves to petition their gods for rain so that their crops would grow. And at the end of the agricultural cycle, they would then have Thanksgiving ceremonies where they would take food in as offerings to the god. Because if you fed the gods would reciprocate and then feed you. So again, you can see some of the examples here. Some of the other caves that we have explored in Western Belize include the Chicabo Cavern or the Chicabo Cave system. This is one of the longest cave systems in Central America. In fact, we mapped about 22 kilometers and had to stop because the cave continues under the border into Guatemala. And sadly, there was no checkpoint there or immigration point. So we decided, no, we can't just go over illegally into Guatemala. This cave, again, is very large. In fact, you can see on one of our trips, we had to camp right at the entrance of the cave. These are tents, by the way. Right? So really massive, massive cave and chamber. You sort of saw one image of this before. This is just a different photograph of that same room, which we call the sand passage. Just again, another view of that cave. Well, beside the archaeology, often we are accompanied by colleagues who are biologists, or we take photographs and then send them off to the biologists or the paleontologists. It depends on what the discovery is. And in many cases, right, because caves have such great preservation of organic material, I showed you the corn cobs, right, or the residues that we find on some of the artifacts. In many cases, we find extinct species of animals. In this one cave, for example, we had the remains of a large extinct vampire bat. In another little pond or small area there that contained water, we also found evidence of tiny spiders and also blind shrimp. Sometimes we have translucent crabs. I mean, you can see through and through these crabs. There's fish in some of these caves that have no eyes because they have adapted to living in the total dark for thousands and thousands of years. So the biology of the caves are equally as interesting as the archaeology. In this same cave, we also found the entire skeleton of a cave bear. And I remember when I first looked at this, I thought, what, a lot of my friends that grew up in Belize with me will not believe this when I say to them, that it used to snow in Belize way back, perhaps during, the Pleistocene Ice Age. And the fact that we have some of these species that certainly survived much better in colder climates, provides some evidence that during the peak of the Ice Age, the climate in Belize was certainly nothing like it is today. Right? Anyway, we can. One other interesting feature of this cave is the discovery of this sort of KT boundary. You can see this area here is really dark and this area is a little lighter. Now, we all know that dinosaurs went extinct around 65 million years ago. And today it's fairly well established that the reason why the dinosaurs went extinct is because of this meteorite that smacked into the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. Well, Belize is the sort of southeastern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And we sometimes, in some of these caves, actually find evidence of this impact. And many of the geologists that have traveled with us to explore some of these caves have identified the possibility that that's what we might be seeing in Aktun Kabal. Now, I should also tell you that speleothems. Now, speleothems is a fancy word that we use that includes any kind of cave rock. So stalagmites grow up from the ground up, stalactites, they hang on tightly to the roof, and other types of rocks. Well, they also have stories to tell. And they really go well with the theme of this year's Festival of Science. We now know that you can look at various different materials and use them to determine past or ancient climatic patterns and changes in climate. In fact, many of these remains really have what we call Paleoclimate Archives or information. We know that we're in the American Southwest. This is the land where tree ring dating was really developed, right, because of some of the trees and the amazing preservation that we have in Arizona. But we also know that there are other organisms in the ocean, like foraminiferas, that you can also look at and analyze, and they will give you really interesting information about changing climatic patterns in the past. or you can take sediments from lakes, right? We've done some of that. In fact, we're about to start a project where we're going to go throughout Belize where there's some lakes, and we're going to sink these units in to get some of the cores and try to see whether they tell us anything about climate over the last at least 2,000 years when the ancient Maya were living in Belize. Well, today we also know that you can use stalagmites to do the same kind of thing, right? And I want to share with you some of this really interesting research. I'm just going to quickly go through that stuff. Again, I'm just going to give you a very brief description of how this works, right? We know that, right, stalagmites and stalactites are formed by drip water. And often what happens is that that water is laden with oxygen isotopes, right? Oxygen 18, 17, 16. And by comparing the ratio of these oxygen isotopes, you can tell wet years from dry years. Just like when you look at tree rings, right? When the ring is thicker, it usually means that it was a wetter year. When the rings are thinner, it means you had a drier year. It doesn't work like that with stalagmites and stalactites, but it does work sort of similar in this way. Every year, the stalagmites form a new ring. And today we can actually date each of these using a system called uranium-thorium method of dating, but we can also measure the oxygen isotopes. And so we collected some of these, and we did that for the 2,000 years from the start of Maya civilization to the end. And the information we gathered from that was just incredible. And here you can see some of my colleagues harvesting that one stalagmite in this Yokbalam cave. Here is a good example of these stalagmites. You can see these small rings, right, from the core going right out. And actually we cut it in half, and then we're able to do the measurements and the dates. I mentioned that you can do the same sort of thing looking at lake sediments, and that's a project that we are about to start. We just got this grant with some colleagues over in the United Kingdom, and we're hoping to start the project in June of 2022. Hopefully, COVID will allow us to travel to Belize and do that. But anyway, what we've been able to do is to take this information and look at all the other examples where other colleagues have looked at paleoclimate data, and we've been able to compare what we have with them. And here, let me just briefly explain what you're seeing here. These are all the different or the other examples of some of the proxies used by other colleagues to try to determine climate change in the ancient past. And here is the results of our study of that stalagmite. And these are dates, right? Going from the birth of Christ all the way 400 AD, 800 AD, 1200 AD. And whenever you see the peaks down to the bottom, those are really dry years, long-term droughts. And then the peaks at the top were rainier years. Well, if you look carefully at this, right, we know that ancient Maya civilization starts to decline and eventually falls apart sometime between 800 to about 1000 AD. And what was happening there in terms of climate? Well, you can see some major droughts start to hit from about 750 AD. And look at this long-term drought, and then it really gets bad around 900 to about 1000 AD. Right? So we now know that the Maya were having to contend with really large populations and trying to feed them during one of the most difficult and challenging periods of their existence, a period of prolonged drought that exceeded more than 10 years long. Usually, prehistoric cultures can deal with a 1 or 2 year, maybe even a 3 year long period of drought. But when you have decadal long, 10 years long drought, then it becomes really challenging. We know that even, in developed parts of the world, in fact, many of you may recall, right, the Dust Bowl right here in America. Right? And that happened not too long ago in the early 1900s. And that was a decadal long drought. It was about 10 years. What did the people of that part of America did by the, I think it's the Texas or the Oklahoma panhandle, but that area around Texas, Oklahoma. Eventually, people started to abandon that area. In fact, more than 1 million people left that region and moved to California, to Montana, and to other parts of the Western United States, because decade-long droughts are really hard to deal with. Because we have this data, we've now been able to start to examine whether, right, these kinds of processes may have affected ancient Maya civilization to the point that they started to abandon many of the ancient cities that they had built. And there again are the major drought years. When we put all this together, right, our research is really, at the forefront of trying to combine not just paleoclimate data, but also looking and seeing what's happening in some of these sacred places. For example, what we found from the cave research is that the Maya were using caves from at least 1500 BC, but they would go in once in a while and do ceremonies and then leave. But that period between 800 and 900 AD, they start to intensify the use of caves. And that's the period of time when we see that they're going in there, they're taking offerings, they're sacrificing people, they're letting their own blood, right? And usually what we've deduced from this is that desperate times call for desperate measures. And perhaps the reason why the Maya were intensifying ancient rituals like those in caves is because when you are in that kind of situation, everyone seeks divine intervention. You want to pray to your God, right? Before that, you might try technology, and when technology fails you, you then look for divine intervention. So I can skip this. But today, like I said, we're getting a much better understanding of what happened during this incredible time when Maya civilization starts to come apart. And we're doing that because we've been able to apply hard science in our study of the archaeology of that region. Today, some of my students have had the opportunity to go to some of these cave sites with me. In fact, some of them have also done their theses. In this case, Dagmar up at the top there wrote her MA thesis here at NAU, looking at the art, right, that we find in some of these subterranean sites, art like handprints or even carvings on the wall. Now, another project that I've been involved with that really started to develop a few years before I came to NAU, but has really taken off since I got here, was to try to integrate archaeology with tourism development. In many ways, it allows us to be able to assist the Belize government, which is, Belize is a developing country. We're trying to protect, preserve some of these sites, but then also use them for tourism and therefore create employment, especially in rural communities. So this project, like I said, began some years ago, and in fact began at this, one of the sites where it began was the site of Cacao. And you can see what some of these sites look like before we started this major project of excavation and conservation. That's that same building after a few months of excavation. Several months later, and exactly about 376 days, just over a year, we ended up with this. Now, this is a massive, massive building. If you look carefully here, those are people going up the top of the pyramid. So you can see why it took us, just over a year to do all that work. When I left Belize to come to NAU, the Belize government asked me, hey, can you continue this kind of work? And I said, well, if we can get the funding to do so, certainly. I mean, it's a win-win situation because myself and my students, we have this opportunity to learn more about the ancient Maya, to participate in a really incredible project. And at the same time, Belize benefits because many of their ancient sites are excavated, conserved. Like I said, it creates jobs, especially in rural areas. So we agreed to do this project. And fortunately, this incredible gentleman that I had met back in 2012, who has been funding much of the work that we do in Belize as an independent donor, said to me, tell you what, I will commit to the work you're doing there for 5 years. So I remember drafting up this 5-year plan to go to Xunantunich, to take my NAU students there, and we'll do this, incredible work. I can tell you that 5 years have passed, and he continues to support us. So let me just share with you some of the things that we have done at Ancient Xunantunich. So like I said, every year, except for last year because of COVID, we have been going down to Belize, and I have about sometimes anywhere between 20 and 30 students. And we have 2 sessions. We do a June session and then a July session. So the students go for 4 weeks and they learn field methods in archaeology. And we work hand in hand with our Belizean counterparts. This project, in fact, when many years ago, when we first started it, this was what that main pyramid looked like. Right? And again, I think I was talking to the dean a little while ago, and he said that just this past summer, he and his family were down in Belize and they visited Xunantunich. Well, had you gone some years ago, that's what Xunantunich would have looked like. So we started to excavate, and gradually we started to expose this building. And today, if you go there, that's what that big pyramidal structure looks like. That is still the second tallest building in the country of Belize. The tallest one is the one that I showed you before, that other large pyramid. In 2014 or 2015, I took one of the first groups of graduate students from NAU to Xunantunich. And I remember having them work on a structure. Sorry, let me just go back here. On this little building here, called Structure 820. And I wanted to do that because a good friend of ours who has lived in Flagstaff for many years had worked on this building back in the 1990s. And she had reported that the building was really well preserved and really beautiful. So, and it's really unique. The architecture there is different from the rest of the architecture from the site. So I thought, you know what? Why shouldn't we go back there and re-expose it and then maybe conserve it now that we have the funding to do that? So we did. This is one of my grad students, Hannah Zanotto, looking at the mound before we started. So at the end of about a month and a half, this is what that building looked like, and after conservation. So again, you can see how we went from this mound that was just covered in dirt to something now that visitors can see when they visit the site. One of the amazing things too about many of my students is that many of them eventually end up in graduate programs, sometimes here, but also in other parts of the world. Just to quickly give you an example, right? These 3 and this one here are all in PhD programs right now in England, in Texas, in Arizona, and in Pittsburgh. Dagmar and Bonnie did their MAs here, and they are now working out there. Dagmar works for the Forest Service, and Jack is presently enrolled in our graduate program here. So again, I think some of these experiences, right, that the students have really, tweak their interest in archaeology, and many of them go on beyond NAU to do either PhDs or gainfully employed in places like the Forest Service or the Park Service. I'm just going to show you some before and after pictures here. There are those 3 pyramids, and we were just starting to excavate there, and after the process of excavation and conservation. And the students, I remember just before the end of the summer, were out in the courtyard celebrating that we had completed that work. Another one of my students who finished here at NAU with us and is now doing her PhD in England at the University of London, has been excavated some of the palace buildings at the site. And this is after we've conserved this. But one of the things that Tia has been able to find is that some of the rooms, you can see there's a door to the room, and there is actually graffiti painted all over the floor. And you can see some of that graffiti. We also lucked out because one of these actually gave us a date that falls sometime around the 8th century. So we know when some of these events were taking place. So the ability to be able to translate the hieroglyphs that we sometimes find carved on these buildings allow us to put these events at specific time in the past. Another one of my grad students, Diane Slocum, had never done any archaeology in her life, but she decided she wanted to pursue a master's and perhaps even a PhD in archaeology. So she came to NAU to work with us, and we go down to Belize, and I said to her, Diane, for your MA, how about you excavate this small building? Now, this little pyramid here had been excavated in the past. In fact, way back at the turn of the 1900s by this British medical doctor turned archaeologist by the name of Thomas Gann. And he had excavated up on top and had found a burial. In the 1990s, a team from UCLA had also excavated on that southern section of the building. So I said to Diane, okay, we're going to put a trench on the eastern side of the building. And in fact, there's Diane. Some of the workers, some of the students, I think it was during lunch break, but Diane, true to form, was still there recording some of the information from the excavations. Well, I expected that we were not going to find very much from the work on this little pyramid. Oh boy, was I ever wrong. In fact, in the first week, we started to find carved monuments on the two sides of that building. We excavated at the base. Let me just show you some examples. So there, at the base, there's the stairway, right? This is just a drawing of the building, the stairway. We found the two carved panels with hieroglyphic inscriptions. We found offerings. There you can see the offerings. And then we found this large tomb. And inside the tomb, this is just a sample of the objects we found in this large tomb. Unfortunately, the roof had collapsed and smashed many of the things that we had discovered in there. Here's a photograph of the two hieroglyphic panels that were discovered. And you can see the hieroglyphs are still beautifully preserved, which then allowed us to decipher them. And the story they told was about conflict, about war between these neighboring cities, right? And we also figured out that the city we were excavating had been involved as an ally of one of these bigger major capitals as they were going at each other. Well, another really interesting piece of this research, as I said, was that we found this tomb right close to the base of the building. And because the roof had fallen in, right, there you can see, that's a drawing, those are all broken pots, and there was where the body was, right? It was really hard to determine whether the individual in this tomb, was it a male, was it a female? And the reason why that was important for us is because we usually when we find tombs in big pyramids, they're predominantly male. They're the remains of some of the rulers. And so we just assume, well, perhaps that was the case in this situation. But we decided to apply the hard science. And we did a couple things, actually 3 different things. First thing we did was we dated it. And we got dates that came back sometime in the 8th century. So we knew when this person had died. Well, we actually also had some ceramic pots with Maya dates, which helped us even narrow it down to about within a 20-year period that the person had died. Then we did something called strontium isotope analysis on the bones, especially using the teeth. Strontium isotope analysis allows you to examine, especially looking at teeth enamel. Here's what it does. Again, I'm going to give you a very sort of layman's description of how strontium works. We know that humans eat plants. Well, we know that plants absorb minerals from the soil. And then when you eat those plants, you then absorb those minerals. And if you eat those plants that were grown around where you live, the signature, that your strontium signature, will be within the range of everyone that lives in that area. But let's just say that you came from another city that was 500 miles away. The trace elements, and especially with the minerals that you have, will be different from those of people that are local. So we did strontium analysis of this, and the individual was local. We then decided to do DNA. And what we found out was truly interesting and exciting. It was not a male individual, it was a woman. And what was amazing about that is that we're starting to learn more and more, because of some of these studies, that there were many accomplished women in ancient Maya society. In fact, there are some examples where women rulers, right, engaged in warfare. They also engage in political intrigue, from one big city to the next. And so when we started to do this work on this little temple at Shenantonich, right, we never thought that we would end up, right, making all these truly incredible discoveries and be able to add to the story and the history of this ancient city. In 2018, another one of my grad students, Cassandra Feely, she had done, I think, her undergraduate major in psychology. And she decided that, she wanted to do archaeology. So again, we go to Belize in the summer. And I remember saying to Cassandra, guess what? For your MA thesis, I want you to excavate this ball court. It doesn't look like a ball court. We know the ancient Maya developed this ball game where they would take a hard rubber ball and you'd have players at each end of the playing alley. So players here, players there, and they would bounce that ball back and forth, hitting it with their shoulder, with their hip. You didn't want to kick it like a soccer ball because a solid rubber ball would break your toes. And I knew that other people had excavated here. So I figured, Cassandra's just starting off. Maybe it'd be good for her to get, do some work where, there's very little chance that we're going to make any kind of major discovery that's going to be more difficult and more challenging to interpret. So sure enough, we started to excavate there. This is what it looked like when we had finished excavating and conserving it, right? Well, down the middle, before we conserved it, we put several excavation units because what I've learned from some work that I've done at other sites is that often the Maya would leave offerings in these ball courts to commemorate the construction of these buildings. We sort of do certain things that are quite similar. Often when we build big buildings, right, we might put a cornerstone and say, President, Cruz or President Biden, if you get, if you can attract President Biden to come and to, celebrate the opening of a big building. My office is in Raul Castro building, and there's a big plaque there, right, that mentions Raul Castro. Well, we know that the ancient Maya didn't put those kinds of plaques, but they would leave offerings to commemorate the construction of that building. Now, as I said, other people had excavated here, so I didn't expect us to find anything. Boy, was I wrong. Right? The first few days, Cassandra calls me and she goes, I think we have something here. And I said, yeah, you definitely have something there. Right? Because what we had were these two vessels, one on top of the other, right there. Cleaned it up, lifted that vessel, and inside we have all these, stone objects that we call eccentric flints. And also there were 4 of those stingray spines, and you guys now know what the stingray spines look like, right? That were probably used to, right, let blood as part of the offering. By the time we finished, she had found 4 of these offerings. All told, we found about over 90 or close to 90 of these things that we call eccentric flints. Today, right now, as I'm speaking, another one of my graduate students is now doing her MA on the analysis of all these objects. We're trying to see, are there certain forms that, that are predominant? And just to, to give you an example, we have some forms that look like scorpions. Right? There again is a little scorpion. There you can see a really good example of that. Some look like, crescents. Others look like centipedes. So, do these forms have some kind of significance? And as I said, one of my students, Jordan, is presently doing that study. Well, another one of my colleagues right here at NAU, and some of you may know Dr. Leszek Pavlovich, he has been able to develop this really cool photography and apply it to archaeological materials. Right? And it's called reflectance transformation imaging. And he does magic with this camera. I mean, here you can see, right? There's a beautiful laurel leaf biface that we found. And it's still very stained because of the earth, right? The dirt where we discovered it. With the kind of photography that he now does, it's almost like the LiDAR, right? But using it on artifacts. You can see, you can tell every detail. And what this allows us to do is to determine the types of technology or the manufacturing process that went into producing some of these finely made objects. In fact, this blade is razor thin. And so it wasn't just any, Joe or Jane trying to experiment that produced some of these things. You had to be very, very, adept at doing this kind of thing. Essentially, you had to be a professional. Well, he has also done it on some of those eccentrics that we found in the ball court. And so again, my students here at NAU have been looking at some of these. So here you can see just a regular photo. And then when you apply the RTI, you can see much greater detail to this, right? Leszek has also been able to take photographs of some of the ancient monuments that we found at the site. Now, many of these monuments have, when you look at the, when you look at them, right, the detail escapes you because they've been weathered. These monuments were left exposed to the elements for over 1,000 years. And all the rain and acid rain today is even worse because these are limestone monuments. But the acidity in the rain has contributed to, to their poor preservation. Well, we decided a couple of summers ago, why not try some of this photography on some of these monuments? And the work that Leszek has been doing has now, or is allowing us to get so much more detail that we can now we can draw them much more accurately, and we can start to see some of the hieroglyphic inscriptions that tell us who those people were, when they came to power, what they did, and when they died. Leszek, again, recently was featured, both him and another one of my colleagues, Chris Downham, were featured in New York Times because of this really interesting article they published, where they essentially developed this computer program. It's like artificial intelligence, where this program, and again, I wish Leszek was here, he could give you a much better, description of how this thing works. But essentially, you can take a bunch of photos of artifacts. They first did it with pottery, broken pottery. And you feed all the photos and images into this computer program. And the artificial intelligence in this program essentially starts to separate them according to type. And so eventually it groups them, right, by certain, shared characteristics. And just a few days ago, Leszek and I talked about this. He's been to Belize with me, obviously, because he's been doing some of the photographs. We have about 1,000 of these figurines that date to around 800 BC. And so what we're thinking of doing is to photograph these, enter these photos into this computer program, and see whether they will help us to determine, right, do these represent images of people? Do they repeat, right? How many types do we have? So there's a lot of this kind of information that when we apply, good science, we can really learn much more than we could using just, traditional ways of conducting some of the analysis. And that's why, as I said, when I started to do this presentation, I mentioned that one of the things that I love about what I do, archaeology, is that it's truly at the intersection of the social behavioral sciences and the hard sciences. Because by applying some of these scientific methodologies and scientific techniques, today we're learning things about the ancient Maya that 5 years ago, in fact, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, we never knew. We're now coming to the understanding that, these ancient cities in the jungle were so much more complex and so much larger than anything we previously assumed, right? We're learning about the people that developed Maya civilization. By applying things like strontium isotope analysis, we can now tell when people migrated from one place to the next. Sometimes when we apply DNA, we can determine, right? Whether people were related to each other. Were they male? Were they female? Today, we can also look at some of these remains and determine whether, individuals in some of these societies, did they have any kinds of nutritional deficiencies, right? Whether they had protein deficiency or, calcium deficiency, iron deficiencies. That has been something we've been able to do before, but with some of the new techniques, we're able to do it even much better than we were able to do so in the past. And so even though we still combine, just old-fashioned archaeology where we gotta, get our lazy bodies through the jungle and then go look for that cave that we were able to identify using the LiDAR, at the end of the day, we come back so much wiser about the past. And so, I just, like I said, we're sort of out of time. I just wanted to share with you some of the highlights of the work that we've been doing in Belize. And, for me, one of the most gratifying things about what I do is that I can share all this with my students here at NAU, both graduates and undergraduates, and that they can also share that partnership that we have with the developing country of Belize. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Awe. That was absolutely inspiring, and I just love your passion. So wonderful. Thank you so much for your talk. I want to take a moment to introduce myself briefly. I'm the new festival coordinator. My name is Elizabeth Vogler, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight with all of you. And we're going to move into our question and answer portion. Before we do so, I'd like to remind you all to fill out this survey this evening and after each of the programs that you attend with the Festival of Science. Each time you fill out that survey, you have the chance to win a pair of Apple AirPods. So make sure to do that. So we have time for about 15 minutes of questions tonight, and we are taking questions from our in-person audience as well as on our Zoom audience this evening. And so as we get ready for our question and answer period, we'll be rotating from our Zoom and our in-person audience. At the end of our question and answer period, we will dismiss the audience here in sections. So if you wouldn't mind just bearing with us for a few minutes as we do that and socially distance. So with that, does anyone on this side of the hall have a question? If you do, go ahead and raise your hand. We have some in the middle here. Perhaps Claire can, my colleague's coming over to you.
I'm not sure if this is a basic question, but with all the artifacts that you found, I know you mentioned that some of your students were studying them. Is that what you do with all the artifacts that are found? Are they brought back to the university to study, or what types of things are done with the items that you find?
Awesome question. So, under Belize law, all antiquities, it's all artifacts, sites belonging to the government or the people of Belize. But we are sometimes able to request permission to export them temporarily or for a period of time. Now, because I was the previous head of the Institute of Archaeology for 14 years, I also get special treatment. I hope no one's listening. But anyway, so, we've been able to often bring many of these objects. And I didn't mention this, but now that you asked it, Dr. Smiley has been able to make casts and replicas. And here's what we do, like a lot of those beautiful eccentrics, he has made casts and replicas of them. And he usually makes about 3 or 4 copies. And so he gives me a copy from my lab here, and then my students can use them. He keeps a copy, and so his students can use them. I take 1, sometimes 2 copies of them down to Belize. goes to the central government, and I take back the originals, and then a set goes to the site where we can exhibit them in the visitor centers. So it's a win-win situation. Yeah.
Dr. Awe, we have a question from an online viewer. How do you engage with stakeholders and community members where you are doing this research?
Again, excellent question. How do I or my project engages with the stakeholders? Well, there's several stakeholders, obviously, right? You have the government of Belize, and they're the officials that have responsibility for overseeing and managing the cultural heritage of the country. But we also have a lot of local stakeholders, right? We work close to this village. Now, all the workers that we hire come from that Maya village. Many of them are people I trained, way back in the 1990s. I'll give you an example. Or a conservator, the guy who supervises all the conservation work that I showed. When many years ago, he came to me and asked me for a job. He was working in a restaurant, in fact, doing dishes in the restaurant. And he said, you guys seem to have such, fun doing what you do. And I said, I'd love to hire you, but I'm only here for like 2 months or 3 months. At the time, I was teaching at the University of New Hampshire. But I hired him, and he worked with us for several years. And then when I went back, I left my job in New Hampshire, moved back to Belize to work for the Belize government. And, we were doing some conservation work, and I hired somebody to come in from Guatemala. And I asked the guy, I said, I'm going to hire you for 4 years, but part of your job is to train Belizeans. And he trained this guy. Today, this Maya gentleman is now the chief conservator for the country of Belize. Another thing we do is, we want to make the work that we do benefit the communities that we work with. Every year, I do tour guide training for the communities around the sites, because then those tour guides, right, will take visitors to the site. And they take pride in, being able to share that information. And it's information that they help to gather. I'm also Belizean, right? I was born and raised in Belize. I'm one of those stakeholders. And so for me, it's, any which way that I can integrate the work that I do with the institution where I work and the students that I work with the people in Belize. It's just an awesome opportunity.
That's great. Does anyone else have a question from this side of the auditorium? See a hand raised over there.
Have you found any evidence of larger animals near the temples?
Larger animals? Yes, actually, again, thanks for asking that question. There are, I had to cut out so many slides because I needed to, cut it down. In several caves that I've worked in, we have actually found the remains of extinct animal species. In one cave, we ended up calling it Mastodon Cave because we found the remains of extinct mastodon, cave bear, horse, giant peccary. In another case, I didn't make this discovery, but after a big flood, after a hurricane, the bank of the river close to my hometown had collapsed. And this farmer found this bone about this big, and he realized right away that it was not the bone of a cow. So he brought it into the Institute of Archaeology. I remember looking at it and I go, I know it's got to be from the Pleistocene Ice Age, an extinct animal. So I sent a photograph to this paleontologist, and he wrote back and he said, that's the femur, the leg bone of a giant sloth. So yes, every once in a while we do discover some of those remains.
Dr. Awe, we have another question online here. This viewer asks, I would think that by increasing accessibility to LiDAR data sets is necessary for the conservation of these sites to try and involve more stakeholders. However, is there any evidence that by making the data sets, oh, there it is again, sorry, it moved on me, more accessible, that it increases instances of looting?
Another excellent question. So one of the things that we tried to do everywhere you go in the world, when it comes to archaeology, we face a problem with looting. That is true here in America. It is true in Central America, South Asia, Africa, wherever you go. And the looters get equally as sophisticated as us, the archaeologists. And so one of the dangers, many times when we do LiDAR surveys of areas that are remote, covered in jungle, right? As you saw, right? We start to expose, or at least we can identify the location of sites. With LiDAR, it's even more so because LiDAR data can be geo-referenced. Every point, every building that you see there is geo-referenced. So with a GPS, you can locate the exact location. So one of the things that we do to try to protect against the availability of that data is that we don't make it public, right? I might show some slides here, but we're not just going to give that out there. And so all the LiDAR data that we have, those of us who got the grant to do it, we have a copy of that. But we have our students use small little sections of it. We don't just say, here's the whole database. And you can't go online and find this data and download it because we don't upload it where it will be available. So we do guard it to try to ensure against that.
Thanks for explaining that. Do we have another question? I see one in the middle here, a couple in the middle.
My background is in engineering and science and technology, and it's simply amazing to me to see these pictures of this detailed architectural structures, massive things that are hard to design and build out in the middle of the jungle. And it's kind of just a silly question. I guess you can comment about all of that. I mean, the ability to, these aren't like the pyramids in Egypt. Those are just big blocks and they pile them together. The detail in the end, anyway, where in the world did all the stones come from? Did they come from rivers? Are there quarries? Anyway, just comments about all of that. I'd appreciate an answer. Thank you.
Yeah. So I remember many years ago when I was an undergraduate student, there were always, there were some articles that claimed that civilization in the Maya world was introduced by Egyptians sailing over. We call that, a very hyper diffusionist perspective. Because, essentially it was trying to say that people over on this side of the pond, were not capable of developing this, these incredible civilizations. Today we know, the pyramids in Mesoamerica, as far as I'm concerned, are really far more beautiful than those in Egypt. The ones in Egypt are pretty, flat on the outside. And many of the Mesoamerican pyramids have incredible detail and decorations and designs. The materials that they use to build them are locally available. In fact, we have found quarries. Some years ago, what we were starting to do is whenever we wanted to conserve a building, sometimes the block of stone, just because of tree roots and, wearing and, more than 1,000 years since it's been left there without any kind of maintenance, just crumbles. And in fact, at the one site that I showed you, we found this quarry and we had some of the guys go down there and we were quarrying the same quarry that was used, 1,000 years ago. So, most of the stones are local. Once in a while, we will find stones that are made, monuments that are made from stones that are not local. But there again, we do the science, right? We look, okay, where's the nearest source of this? We get in touch with geologists or we look at geological maps of the country and go, where do we find slate or where do we find granite as opposed to limestone? And then we can go to those places. We can measure, the distances that they had to travel, moving some of these stones. I'll give you a good example. Belize, in the center of Belize, we have the Maya Mountains. It's the only source of slate in a huge area of that area of Central America. And there's a site in Mexico in the state of Campeche called Calakmul. And there a big monument known as Stela 9 is made from slate. Now, as the crow flies, that's over 100 kilometers. The nearest source of slate is Belize. So we know they had to have moved that piece of slate, or it was gifted by one of the rulers of one of the sites in Belize to the ruler over there. And you know, when people go, well, is that possible? Let's look at Stonehenge, right? Druids moved those huge boulders for more than 50 miles, right? In fact, look at Egypt, right? In Egypt, right, produced most of the, you know, of some of the large monuments, and many of those monuments were removed from Egypt way back during Roman times. In fact, today, guess which country has the most Egyptian obelisks? Or what city? Rome, right? And these obelisks are huge. So the evidence that we have is that they built mostly with local material, but then they also sometimes moved, you know, large stones, exotic stones from very far away.
And I see another question right in the middle there. If you want to wave your hand again. She's coming on your right.
Have you had time to put down any of your material into a book?
Oh, I thought it was funny. The answer is yes. Most of I've done a lot of publications in journals. We get more brownie points for a journal article. You can ask the dean over there. You know, especially if it's a peer-reviewed, more so than a book. But the answer is yes. What I've tried to do is, you know, I have one small booklet called 101 Questions and Answers about the ancient Maya of Belize. And I wrote that. I sort of copied the idea because when I had traveled to Mesa Verde, I saw that they had a little booklet called 101 Questions and Answers about the, you know, the people of the Southwest. So, you know, why reinvent the wheel? But I did it for Belize. And I did it because we were trying to introduce, you know, talking about stakeholders. And, you know, I wanted to introduce Maya studies in the schools in Belize. When I went to elementary school in Belize, I learned, and high school, I learned everything about British and European history because Belize used to be a British colony called British Honduras. You know, we got independence in 1981. I never learned anything about the Maya. And so I thought, you know, people like me need to help introduce Maya studies in the schools in Belize. And then I wrote another one called Maya Cities and Sacred Caves of Belize. And that, you know, has been used, you know, to help train tour guides, but also by people visiting the country, you know, to learn a little bit about all the sites in the country. Yeah.
And I have a question here, Dr. Awe, that's received a lot of votes online. Hi, my name is Lucia, and I'm 10 years old. And my question is, how do you not get lost in the caves?
I pray a lot. You know, I remember when I started caving when I was about Lucia's age. In fact, I took my two boys when I think, and they're right over there. Kai, I think, was 4 and Kellen was 6. And we spent 4 hours in a cave. At the end, I had to carry Kai out because he was burnt out. But, you know, it's the same like going through the jungle. You know, growing up in Belize and going into the jungle, you start to look for certain markers. You know, when I walk through the jungle, I always look at certain trees or I nick a little branch. So, you know, I know that I've been through there. With the caves are even trickier because when you're going through a cave, you have that headlamp. And you can only see a small area. It's like, you know, I was a little thrown a little while ago when I started the presentation because I couldn't see out there, right? And those lights hit you right here. But anyway, so in the cave, you can only see a little area. And when you look at something this way, when you look at it from the other side, it looks totally different. So what I would do, especially in long caves, is I would look at formations and give them name, like, that's, you know, the giant, or look, that's the, you know, the head of whatever, or that's some stones are the size of houses, right? That's the house stone, or even kinds of, you know, different kinds of formations. So that's one way to do it. Now, if the passage is really long and it does not, you can sometimes, I sometimes will leave a rock or a pebble, or we can leave flagging tape because they glow in the dark. So you cut a piece of flagging tape and you drop it and you drop it. So when you turn back, your light, just like here, you will see the flagging tape. And then you go picking it up. You don't want to leave it in the cave, right? Only leave footprints in the cave. And if you can avoid leaving footprints, even better.
We have time for just one more question. I think I see one on this side.
Hi, Jaime. Kai would like to know, how many caves do you think are unexplored in Belize?
How many caves have been unexplored in Belize? Hundreds. I've been in a lot of caves. I think I've been probably over 100 caves easily. But there are probably a lot more caves that I have never been into. That's how I'd like to live 1,000 years. I'm hoping that I'm going to find the fountain of youth.
Well, thank you all so much for your insightful questions, and to our online viewers as well. And thank you again to Dr. Awe for his wonderful presentation. Let's give him another round of applause. And thanks to everyone here who's joined us this evening, both in person and online. It's been a wonderful night. And I hope to see you all tomorrow at Science in the Park at Wheeler Park, as well as many other events happening over the next 10 days. And thank you to our keynote sponsor, W.L. Gore and Associates, for being here tonight and for all your support. And we look forward to the next 10 days. Thank you again. Good night.